have a great privilege to learn from Mrs. Harper tonight. Mrs. Harper's late husband, Jack Harper, was a coordinator for the John Birch Society in Michigan. Mrs. Harper has been the program director of Camp Constitution since its inception and has been instrumental in developing every aspect of the academic program for this camp. So, let's welcome Mrs. Harper!
Well, thank you very much. Oops, I guess I'm supposed to be using this?
Yeah.
Okay, is that coming through the way it's supposed
Yes.
to? All right. The topic tonight is real education versus Common Core. A lot of you have probably parents and relatives who are doing their best to prevent Common Core from becoming the law of the land or whatever you want to call it. And they're probably already plotting what they're going to do if it does, and so on. But it's a trap. It's a trap that has been set over a period of 100 years. They've been trying to socialize education and everything else in this country. They've changed education, law, culture, all sorts of things have been ruined. But what I'd like to do is first just do a little reflection on what real education is, and you can see to what extent you are engaged in real education, those of you in your home schools and those of you in your public schools. And by the way, I want to make some comments. You see all this material here?
Yeah.
I didn't have anything to do with creating it. Two very wonderful people that are at this camp made all these boards. The backgrounds were put on by Campbell Egan and her mother, Mrs. Egan, Tracy Egan, did presumably the research and paste ups for the rest of it. We obviously aren't going to cover all that today. That would probably, if I just plain read it, it would take hours. I read it aloud. So what I wanted to do is just give a little bit, a hint of the contrast between the kind of education you would have gotten in the old one-room schoolhouse. I got the belfry here and so on. And by the way, I'll tell you, this is a little bit of a make-do situation. I got the board, it had a blemish, the white was broken out from here, and there was some kind of sticker here. So this gave me this epiphany of an analogy. So we have the traditional, small town, the little church, the high school, there's a lot of houses around here that you can't see, the blacksmith shop, one thing and another. And then there's the school. And typically the school was off at the edge of town, and there would be some grass and trees and a stream or a pond or something of great interest. And education at that time was in the control of the parents. They ran it through local boards of education, or maybe even more simply in the earliest days on the prairie, probably the parents of children of school age simply got together and said, we need to have a school, who can we get to teach it? And they went from there. But as it developed, and by the time I came along, which was slightly past this era in general, there was a local board of education. And this would typically be half a dozen or so of the men of the community who were respected for their knowledge and ability. And they would set up a budget for the school, maybe get the others up together to have a school raising, build the place, and so on. But that isn't so much the important part, but the contrast between the parents and the school. There's not all this bureaucracy, there's not all this difference, not all these layers of policy and administration and so on. Whereas here, now you see the picture of the tornado sweeping this way to wipe out traditional schools and education. This tornado is the Common Core, and as I say here, it's like a worldwide tornado to wreck learning everywhere. And who controls it? And I didn't even get I started with the list before I had to do some other things. But it's under the United Nations. It's not an American idea. In fact, it's an anti-American idea. Because America is always, of course, on the side of free enterprise and individual or family control of anything. The UN is a bad enough thing that there have been bills in Congress for many, many years to try to get the United States out of the UN and throw the UN out of the United States. One of the questions on the test involved whether it was a good idea or a bad idea to get out of the UN. And some of you have not apparently heard both sides of the story, so you thought maybe it was a bad idea. For a number of years, I've worn one or the other of two buttons. This one with the UN with the traditional symbol meaning forbidden. You know, like if they put a P in this circle with a slash across it, it means no parking. Well, I'm saying no UN. And we have another one with that slogan again, get us out of the get us out of the UN. A part of the UN, and a very notorious part for many, many years, several, well, decades since it's been involved. The UN, by the way, was founded after the close of World War II. But while I was teaching at Kennewa Hills High School back in the 1960s, there were actually textbooks that made statements like, the United Nations won World War II.
Oh, wow.
Pretty much everybody knows that World War II was a balancing act going on in Europe, and we got in, and at great sacrifice of many, many people, a lot of it unnecessary probably, but anyway, we did turn that thing around, and of course Hitler was gotten rid of, and his way of life, and his dictatorship, and so on. But the Common Core, interestingly enough, either barely mentions Hitler in, for example, their American history courses, and maybe that's because they're a lot like Hitler. The kinds of things that they want to do are fully as evil as the things that Hitler did. This stood for, originally, so they told us, the United Nations Educational, Social, and Cultural Organization. That is one of the key sponsors, if you will, of this, but that organization is supported in large measure, as the whole United Nations is, by US tax dollars. So we spend our money to finance an organization that, contrary to American ideals, wants to get rid of American education, put American school children to work in menial and stupid jobs. I mean, I'm not trying to demean any kind of work, but it's not about getting people to be able to extend themselves and do the things that they're really capable of. It's about dumbing them down, slowing them down, and simplifying their minds, making them incapable of real thought. Dr. Harshman had another term for this. Can you stand and tell exactly what you think those letters stand for?
I looked at it just now and I said UNESCO also stands for undoing nearly every student's career opportunities.
Yeah, that's good.
That's good. Thank you so much.
That's good. Right there. That's good.
And another big sponsor is Bill Gates. What company or what name do you associate him with? What brand? All of you?
Microsoft.
Microsoft. The reason I don't ask one person and call on one, I know there's this ticket system going, but I can't operate that way because I can't necessarily hear one voice. But if enough of you talk, I can hear it. Okay, so Bill Gates is another big financier. There are some big beneficiaries. There are testing companies. And basically, as part of this whole dumbing down thing, instead of the old days when students strive to be, number one in the class, or last one up in the spelling bee, or the person who, did the best oration or whatever, now it's like, we don't have to pass the test the first time. They'll give it again. And you know what? It costs your parents or somebody money every time they give it. Because these tests are expensive. They come from companies that make their entire living off indoctrinating and testing students. But let's get back a minute to what a traditional education involved. It was, sorry, I know I'm not supposed to be moving around. The traditional education involved giving every student the best shot he had at getting in his mind the tools necessary not only for a successful life, but a challenging and interesting life, a life with variety and travel and investigation, research, serious interest in things. Life wasn't about plodding to the workplace and hammering at the stone in the quarry all day and going back to a hovel. Then it was about you can be what you can follow your dreams, you can be what you are capable of doing, and the more, whatever you find to do, the more it helps other people, the more you will be rewarded. So in the traditional thing, the fellow that invented the better mousetrap had the world beat a path to his door. Well, if you were an inventor or an artist or whatever, you would do better because of the basic traditional education. You would have a better shot at it. Now, a few people get to be superstars, and not necessarily deservedly. They may be superstars because they're carrying out another agenda. They may be superstars because they're trying to inculcate us with some demonic culture. We've heard about that in other classes here, so I know it's true. Anyway, so basically, what among, let's say, turn it around. Among the most basic things, parents would teach their children how to get along with other children. And one of the first things you'd learn is to have a friend, be a friend. And people learned not to be nasty and tattletales and not to, trip somebody that might otherwise have been their friend and so on and so forth. But we were a far cry from a society of crime in school and so on. In those days, and as even up to my time, back at the beginning of World War II, schools were really a pretty civilized place. And you went there to learn and to make friends. And friends was a very big part of it. But they were the people there were your neighbors. They were within walking distance, say within 2-3 miles. And you weren't afraid to walk 2 or 3 miles. It was good for you. And it was worth it. And there wasn't all this stuff out there to worry about because the culture overall was still decent. People believed in honor. People learned self-control. They learned not to blow up at their friends. They learned that if it looked like their friend slighted them to talk to somebody else, that maybe she just needed to answer a question or whatever, and there wasn't anything to fight about. They learned to give and take. They played hard. A lot of times they snuck down to the water even if they weren't supposed to, and they learned about pollywogs and all kinds of things down there, and it was all good. But the basics, they were all taught to read, and they were taught rather quickly and simply. They learned the sounds of they had learned the sounds of the letters at home. By the time they got to school, and they had learned, of course, the alphabet and the right order for things. They were taught the sounds. The English language is really very straightforward and simple. yes, it's the language with probably the broadest ability for expression. There are nuances in many areas, but not all areas are we the best. For example, in English, we have a few terms related to snow in the wintertime. Skiers have a few more than the rest of us, maybe. They might talk about a sugar snow or a corn snow or, whether it's slushy or not, and so on. But the Eskimos were the champions in words for snow. They had at least 9 different terms for it. But of course, you learn factoids like that, along with learning real things and building vocabulary. But you not only learned how to read the words, you learned how to pronounce them, and there were standardized ways of doing this. Nowadays, if you listen especially to like National Public Radio, you will find lots of mispronunciations. Now, some of it is kind of legitimate, because some people, if they're broadcasting in English on BBC, they're not native English speakers. So the fact that they can convey their ideas at all is good. But another part of it refers to what Mrs. Hall talked about as the last act of revolution of the American War for Independence, and that was Webster's Dictionary of 1828. So it's nearly, half century, well, depending on which end of the war you look at, but half century after the War for Independence was fought, the dictionary was written, and it wiped out a lot of unnecessary Englishisms, if you will. If any of you are at all widely read, you've probably encountered wonderful old books, Charles Dickens or Robert Louis Stevenson or something, where the word honor would be spelled, instead of H-O-N-O-R, it'd be H-O-N-O-U-R. Yes, they had that extra letter in honor and valor and color and all sorts of terms. Anyway, that's kind of a sideline. I love rabbit trails, but I have to not go on them. Yes?
I was just amen in the rabbit trails. This is the amen corner.
Oh, I forgot that. I know you explained it to somebody else. But anyway, this 1828 dictionary was a very Christian-oriented dictionary and would use citations from the Bible for the definitions of words where applicable. And it's also a very good reference now, even for terms, say, of law and other fields of endeavor. But anyway, it's a very basic thing, learning to read, and yet many people are unable to do it. They're functionally illiterate. Some of them can barely read a bus schedule. I mean, they're just in really bad shape because of the dumbing down that's gone on, particularly over the last 54 years now. I have to think back a ways. But basically there was a turning point around 1960. But there were earlier turning points when they first took all sorts of good subjects like history and geography and melded them together in something called social studies. And social studies is just to get you used to socialization, being socialized, being made socialistic, being made communistic, communal, collective, all those sorts of things. America, as you all probably have a sense of, or so on, was about individual rights under God, individual development under God, individual aspirations, seeking to, breathe in the higher atmosphere, if you will, inspiration. And in fact, we know that there was never an intention for government to run education. Never an intent by our founders. Our founders, in fact, did not mention education in any of the major founding documents that most of you are familiar with. You noticed it didn't occur in the Declaration of Independence. It's not in the Constitution, and it doesn't belong there, either of those places. And it wasn't in all those other documents going back to the, whatever it was of 1100. Do you remember? Mrs. Hall mentioned that, the year 1100, some of the people got together and came up, or had a king come up with some stuff. Anyway, about rights. But there is one document that was created the same year as the Constitution. Now I'm going to ask you a few questions, and these are general questions for everybody to answer. We often hear that George Washington was the first president of the United States. That's an incomplete sentence. It should say the first president of the United States under the U.S. Constitution. Did we have other presidents before George Washington? Just a simple yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. How many? Anybody know?
8.
Was it 8? Okay, I would have guessed 7. I haven't read it lately. But I think one of them was named Hanson. I mean, there were all kinds of other names that were earlier presidents. We didn't hear much about them because, for one thing, the Articles of Confederation was so limited that they had one-year terms. The idea was that nobody was to get too much power or to have too much time in office. Anyway, during or under the Articles of Confederation, there was a Congress and a president, and the Congress at that time passed, and I've abbreviated here, the Northwest, it was one word, Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It came about because those eastern seaboard states, such as the one we're in, many of them had lands in the West that they had won as a result of what, the French and Indian War and so on. And they had decided, or were persuaded, that they should just be their own state where they were and let those western lands go, because those were beyond the Allegheny Mountains. They were north of the Ohio River, hence the name north and west. They were west of the mountains there and north of the river. Those lands, they decided, should become other states when they qualified. So they decided to write a document to kind of put up the terms for becoming a state. What the people that moved out there, these pioneers, these people, Daniel Boone was farther south, but the people like him who moved into places like Ohio and Michigan. By the way, Ohio had the highest concentration of former soldiers of the American Revolution, or the correctly called the War for Independence. Anyway, that document had this one single sentence about education. And there is one prior reference in the Land Ordinance of 1785, and that was not philosophical, though that merely had to do with land. And that ordinance set up the counties. As you go out west, west of here in the Midwest, you'll notice lines are straight, roads are commonly 1 mile apart. It's like a big grid, and not everywhere, but predominantly. And so those of us that come from out there and come back here find that we're always twisting and turning and going up and down. It's a little different. Anyway, they wrote this philosophical statement in the Ordinance of 1787, and it starts out with these words: religion, morality, and knowledge. You won't find any Christian or other known religion in Common Core. You'll find a religion, but it's of somebody else. It's demonic. You won't find our kind of morality. You might find the 10 precepts, but you won't find the 10 commandments. And as far as knowledge, they seem determined to prevent people from learning the truth about anything. You may have heard of people revising history, of kind of faking it or whatever, and telling it the way it wasn't. Anyway, so these 3 basic qualifications have essentially been thrown out of the Common Core. But let's go take the whole sentence. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to, and I left out the words here, good government and the happiness of mankind. That was an accident, but I noticed it because I know the thing by heart. I just don't write and think at the same speed sometimes. Okay, necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. So for those reasons, schools shall forever be encouraged. Encouraged, not owned, not micromanaged, not Federal Department of Educationalized or tested by some alien testing service. They would be encouraged. And anybody who's familiar with the privileges or whatever given to Congress, so among the items that Congress could do, is there one of them you can think of that might help schools? And I'll give you a clue. Books were heavy, hard to transport. What office did we establish in the Constitution? What office was Congress, by office I mean local offices? Yes? Pardon? Okay, anybody ever heard of post offices and post roads? Okay, it would have cost, in many instances, even then, back when a dollar was gold or silver, when it was real money, it might have cost hundreds of dollars to pay the horsemen to go all the way from Boston or someplace, New York, or someplace where something was published, out to Wisconsin or Michigan or these other places. So they created something that for years was known as book rate. And that was a lesser amount of money that was needed to ship books, manuscripts, musical scores, maybe certain other things, possibly some artworks, I don't know. But anyway, those things were transported more cheaply so that these little schools, founded by maybe half a dozen parents in a community, could afford to get books in. And that was very important, and of course books were valued and treasured then. And the other, okay, working from the reading half, let's go to the other kind of major part of education, which would be what? If you work with letters and words in reading, yes?
Writing.
Okay, that you continue working with words there, that's good. Audrey?
English.
The English is the language, it's words and letters. Anybody else? What else do we work with in school? A whole lot, come on. You like it or you hate it?
Math.
Math, okay, numbers. And what, do you know what the numerals are called? Whose numbers are they?
Roman.
They're not Roman, we don't use Roman numbers. We're the ones that looked like this. What are our numbers?
Arabic.
Arabic numbers, yes. Not necessarily because the Arabs invented them. They claim that it was a little farther east, maybe people that spoke Sanskrit way back when. But yes, the Arab culture, the commercial culture that the original Arab and Islamic and so on people, they were huge traders. So that is the kind of the origin of much of the Renaissance in Europe. The renewal of knowledge came because these Arab traders, and that's trade with a D, traders, caravans, that sort of thing. They brought those numbers and other concepts, and they also preserved a lot of knowledge during times when other people were burning libraries and so on. Anyway, so when students are given the twin tools of letters and all the knowledge you can build with those, and numerals, and what's the most important numerals? Anybody ever heard of how many numerals are there?
Infinity.
There are 9 regular numerals, but there's one other that is more important in a sense. 0, yes. And that's another one that the Arabs, as they were called, and I'm using the term Arab not in the sense of Arabia, but because that's what they used to call all those wandering desert peoples. Bedouins is another term. But anyway, so the zero was very important and, of course, essential to modern ways of calculation. But you know, Common Core has found a way even to wreck simple computation. Are we getting to that point?
20 minutes, 20 more minutes.
Oh, 20. Okay, cool. Shoot, should have asked. Okay, so there's different kinds of literacy. There's the literacy that you can read and write, and that refers to, as somebody said, the English language, and so on. But there's also a mathematical literacy, and there are terms for doing various things in math. And you'll find on some of these tests, for example, before the educrats and progressives took over education, there are some tests pasted up here that are really neat to read. One of them was, I think, from like 1885, and they involve this whole vocabulary of higher math, and they were used for high school admission. And now, most people, quote unquote, graduate from high school without knowing half of this stuff. They don't know a tenth of it. And some of them run around with their pants down to here and can't manage to clean up enough to get to work on time, even at McDonald's, to earn their keep. And somehow they end up on SSI or in prison. In fact, there's a growing movement of people who are concerned about what they call the school to prison path. The public schools are set up like prisons in many instances, especially in large cities, but you've got the locked door. The parent can't run in with Johnny's lunch that he forgot. He's got to ring a buzzer and be not even let in then, but the matron or, guard or custodian or whatever will take that lunch and presumably deliver it. But of course they discourage the children even having their own lunches. You probably all heard about the situations shortly after the Obamas were in, where they wouldn't let the child eat the vegetables and things that her mother had prepared. They brought in some chicken nuggets because that would be their more acceptable lunch. Anyway, but the reason I tied the lunch thing in with some of this other stuff, students are given numbers now, and that's their account number. And I have heard tell that if a student couldn't come up with the right number, or if the account was deficient, the lunch that they were about to be handed, the 4 things on a tray or whatever, was dumped in the wastebasket, and they were given a cheese sandwich for lack of a number or lack of the money in the account. Personally, I'd rather either run home for lunch, as I did most of my life, or be able to carry something wholesome, something decent from home. Anyway, I haven't begun to give you all the horrors of this tornado of things, but I want you to understand that it's not just the invention of a moment. This is something that has been going on as a systematic plan since at least the 1890s. So we're talking like basically 125 years ago, in that era. And the people at that time who wanted to change our educational system were English socialists, German socialists, and the Americans who, trying to think of an appropriate term for what they did relative to these people, trying to kind of butter them up and so on. Pardon?
Embraced it.
They embraced this, yes, this evil culture. We have yes, I guess. Okay. That's fine, that's settled in. So, anyway, for well over 100 years, they've been battling in their, that's battling, that's too honorable a word. It's too out in the open. They have been secretly slithering around trying to subvert our education and doing a very effective job of it, regrettably. I was fortunate enough to have, I went to what would, I mean, people would deem it a public school, but it was clearly a Northwest Ordinance school. When we were in second grade, one of the words that we had to learn, and we had to learn why it was superior to other forms, was monotheism. Mono, do you all know the word element mono? What does it mean? One, okay, as in monarchy, right? But also monotheism is one God, because theos is God. So the belief in one God was monotheism. So we had a very little bit of training in those Greek gods and goddesses that were all jealous and murderous souls and did all sorts of miserable things and had snakes growing out of their hair and whatnot, out of their head. And then we learned about God, and we learned that in the context leading up to, say, Thanksgiving. We learned that those pilgrims came over here to practice their religion. And that the first thing they did when they got here, as far as building, was to build a church. And it I suppose initially was also their common storehouse and everything else. They built that, and then they added the other things as they could, and moved out what didn't belong in the church. And there are paintings, you can find them yet, of a man with the pilgrim hat and the whole bit, and his gun, which, because they didn't have rifling and so on, the gun looked more like, the front end of it more like a clarinet. It flared out to let the bullet out rather than keeping it aimed. But anyway, but you'll see the maybe a man in front and then a family group and then maybe another man behind, and they're carrying their muskets to church because they have to defend their families on the way. I don't know if any of you around here have problems with things like cougars, but mountain lions and cougars are coming back into the east. My sister saw one in front of her place, and that's out in the flatlands. That's not this wonderful mountainous territory that would be so good for them to hide in. I don't know, do you have them back here? Not that you know of, maybe? Anyway, they're like a 130-pound cat. And if you've ever been scratched by even a 10-pounder, you can imagine the mayhem that a larger one can cause. Anyway, so that was about protection of the pilgrims and so on. Do you know what they teach now, to the extent they teach Thanksgiving in school? What do they teach? Why do they say we had the first Thanksgiving? Nobody's heard. Okay, good. That means a lot of you are either homeschooled or else that they aren't talking about it at all anymore, which is almost better than lying about it, which is what they did for a number of years. Thanksgiving, as I'm sure you all know, was celebrating the grace of God in rescuing them from the drought on their third year here. The first year, about half the people died over the course of the winter. There was a lot of starvation or near starvation, and then the disease coming in and so on, the cold, the exposure, whatever. The second year wasn't a whole lot better. So by the third year, Governor Bradford says, you know, our charter said that we have to hold all our land in common and everybody gets to work it as they want and gets to eat from it. What do we call that nowadays?
Communism.
Communism, yes. So in effect, they were forming using a small c form of communism by decree from the old country. The charters were made up in England by the people that sponsored these people to come over here, and they were supposed to obey them. The Pilgrims wisely decided, while they were still on the boat, they had gotten to where the waves were breaking on shore, they had anchored out in the bay, and they realized that maybe they needed to do something in case of difficulties. They drew up a document on that ship. And what did they call it?
Mayflower Plan.
The Mayflower Compact, yes. And in that document, they made provision, they acknowledged God, beginning and end, but they made provision for self-government under God. And that's probably one of the first written discussions of self-government. There were other documents that were important, limiting kings and so on. Oh, okay, nothing now?
I was just gonna say, Charlie Brown, the Charlie Brown cartoon series, they
Okay.
have a phenomenal video on what you just explained.
Oh, good.
Done by the Charlie Brown character.
Okay, so those of you into the Charlie Brown cartoons, or if you've not heard of them, you might want to look that up. You can probably get it on, YouTube or something?
Pretty much,
You
yeah.
can get it on Netflix, or you can buy them at the dollar, you can buy them at the dollar store sometimes on video, but you can get them, they have an excellent series. They're very,
Okay,
very good.
so you can get a great series, Charlie Brown on Thanksgiving. Okay, so now what they teach these English farmers who, sold everything and had to basically sneak out of England and get on their ships and come over here, and there was all the trouble with that, and it's a whole other story, and I'd love to tell it sometime. In fact, maybe we'll hear it from Mr. Kenny, I think it is on maybe Thursday. So there is a talk on the Pilgrims, so we'll probably learn a lot in there. But anyway, what they're saying nowadays is that these English farmers came over here, and the only reason they survived is because the Indians taught them how to farm. And it's in more than one book. It's in textbooks. It has been written into fiction by people who grew up under that system and wrote it, trusting it to be true. It's outrageous. And this is all the past bad stuff. Some of the past bad stuff they've done. It doesn't even begin to get into what's in here, but in the Common Core. But this whole socialist history from the 1890s to the present, and surely a little bit into the future, is weighing down on us. We have been brainwashed, even in some decent schools. Things like, well, it's better to have a city manager form of government with an appointed city manager than it is to have an elected mayor and commission and so on. And in Grand Rapids, there has been a concerted effort to get rid of the office of city comptroller. Anybody know what a comptroller does? Yes? Make sure that the money is spent lawfully. The comptroller is the guy that not only supervises that the bill is for the right, might check that it, or the bookkeepers might check that it's the amount of, that was invoiced that they pay, but also that the expenditure was a proper function of government. Well, now they don't like having elected comptrollers, because when people start complaining about taxes and they get a decent comptroller in and say, wait a minute, this is not a proper expenditure. City Commission, go back to square one. You can't do this. So they want to get rid of the elected comptrollers. In many areas, they still have them, but because they don't tell people and the schools don't teach people anymore what that office was for, they just mark whoever's name they see, or whichever, if they're Irish, they mark the Irish name, and if they're not, they mark the other one, if there is another one, and often there isn't, because they don't know how important that job is. Anyway, the reason I'm personally involved with that one, my late husband was an elected comptroller in Grand Rapids, and at that time, they said they wanted to streamline the government to save money for the taxpayers, and they would do that by combining the functions of the comptroller with the treasurer. So you're giving the ability to write checks to the same guy that's checking the check writer. Talk about the fox guarding the chicken house, or the hen house. And the reason I bring it up, the twofold. One is that went down to defeat by the biggest no vote in Grand Rapids history. All the way back, the 1830s or whenever they first incorporated, And there was never a vote that was more unanimously against a reform of that nature. But the other reason that I bring it up is because it revisited us in 2012. It was voted down again, but instead of being 81-19, this time it was 70-30. So the dumbing down has had its effect. And it's that kind of thing that will affect you even if you never yourself are put into a quote-unquote Common Core classroom. But if they have so brainwashed the rest of the population that they vote away the liberty you enjoy, you're up against it. How many minutes did you say? I mean, are we out there?
Sure. We get 6 more minutes.
6 more, okay. Anyway, so this stuff does affect you. It affects your money in the future. It affects your jobs and whether you will be able and educated sufficiently to get a real job that fulfills you and does real good, or whether you're going to be flipping burgers or polishing shoes for a bureaucrat or something. When in the old days, one of the things they taught us in the Northwest Ordinance School was that there were a lot of bad ideas that came out of Europe, and that maybe over here we just didn't need to do those things, and we hadn't been doing them. Now, one of the things they used to say was that if a man were a cobbler or a tailor or whatever, that's what his son had to be. Now, it's one thing if the son wants to be that, but if he's got a gift for rocket science, he ought to be able to do the rocket science. So one of the other bad ideas that they had in Europe was this idea that starting, and by the way, it was the Germans who invented kindergarten. The word means child garden, and it was to bring the little children out of the homes and under the control of the teachers so that they could begin being programmed. And we bought it over here as a very happy idea and so on, that we'd get the practice in those days of walking back and forth to school and be able to play and learn certain things. And there was a certain amount of brainwashing going on, and some people have complained about it later. For example, one of the exercises they used to have, they'd have boys' toys and girls' toys. And you were supposed to circle their idea of what boys' toys were. Well, you can imagine how much trouble I was in. I love trains and ships and pirates and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, so it's not like education was perfect then. But it was good enough so that as we came through it even, we could identify which things were this brainwashing stuff and which things weren't. And by the way, they can use tests themselves, like Iowa Basic or any of the others. They can use them for propaganda purposes. And they may tell you, for example, read these 2 paragraphs and then answer the following 6 questions. Just fill in the little circles by the right answers. And so they can take a perfectly good founding father, write a lot of bad stuff about him, and have you tell what bad stuff they said about him. And you don't even know that none of it's true. It's diabolical. Any basic questions on this? Jillian.
What did the UNESCO mean again? I didn't get it.
Oh, okay, you know what UN is, so you don't have to write that. Educational, EDUC for short. Social, SOC for short. Cultural, and the last one is organization.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for asking. Anybody else? Yes? Oh, you're pointing to somebody. Oh, I'm sorry.
How long did you say this dumbing down has been going on for?
Over 100 years, but it was so minor. You ever seen, what do you call the one where the curve goes up like this?
Scale?
Bell curve.
Line graph?
Not the bell curve, that's the one where they grade you on a curve that says there's a few outliers that got, 0 or something, and then there's a few
Scale?
brilliants over here, and the rest are in the middle.
A graph?
Oh, no, I'm thinking of a mathematical term. But what's the, there's a curve, if you've got a straight line, and something starts small, and then it goes up.
The dumbing, it's too late,
Yes.
the dumbing down has already taken place. Too late.
Okay. Well, regrettably, I'm having a senior moment. I can't even think of the term I was thinking of. Audrey?
What's like
Bill Gates, I think, sees some more dollar signs on this, and I'm not sure of his involvement. There's lots of information here, and I'm sure you'll run into it. Or, simpler, does your family get the New American magazine? Well, you have a couple of copies of things in your packet that might help. And there have been a number of articles written by Duke Pesta, Brian Farmer, Alex Newman in that magazine that will give you the information you need. Maddie?
Is Common Core just in the United States, or is it throughout the whole world?
It is or will be worldwide. We tend to be the experimental grounds. We spend the money, and we're the dummies who dumb ourselves down. And it's too bad, but in Vietnam and other places, their government is already bad and socialistic, so they're still teaching them math and stuff because they don't have to get anything more from them. Here, well, we're certainly way down that path. In fact, another topic for this that would be good would be the tie-in with the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. In brief, the Communist Manifesto has been adopted by this country as policy, quote-unquote law, meaning statutes and so on. For example, property tax, income tax, inheritance tax, the Federal Reserve, and free public education for all are all in the 10 planks. Yes? Yeah.
Why did they stop teaching cursive in
Why
some
what?
schools? Why did they stop teaching cursive in some schools?
Teaching
Cursive.
cursive writing. I think because that hand-eye coordination and stuff that you would learn with that was something they just want us to lose. You should probably check with Sam Blumenfeld on that. Some of his books may be on Mr. Shirtliff's table, I don't know. Yes?
It's my understanding that in the reading literature aspect of Common Core, there's a concerted effort to corrupt the morals of the...
Oh,
So
absolutely.
could you speak a little about the moral aspect of Common Core?
Well, we had a hint of it this morning. Many of the students that are of high school age knew about The Great Gatsby. And what did Mrs. Hall say about that? It was like a list, how'd she put it? Like a morality story with all the bad morality, all the things you should not do. This type of thing goes way worse than that, and like the Communist Manifesto, devalues women even while promoting gender issues. And this whole feminist movement was basically a communist plot to devalue girls and womanhood and virtue and replace them with slutty dress and behavior.
There's a real effort to promote a homosexual lifestyle.
That too, yeah. Yeah, that's a big one. And the interesting thing, they still prosecute people who act on those impulses, but at the same time they're teaching them in the schools. I have to end now. I just got my throat is slit sign. I'd be glad to answer any or take any other discussion. Camel? Yes?
Comment on.
All right, Ken,